There is so much historical amnesia.
Historical amnesia?
Historical amnesia.
Historical amnesia. In layman terms, it means to forget or actively neglect the past so you can justify your present and idealized future. We all have or have had it in our lives. It's the basis of all things happening in the world today, from COVID-19 to Brexit to all the civil wars and crises killing millions a year. And it's the reason for this, and this. To understand what is happening in the world now, we must have an understanding of what has happened so that we can choose to make better what will happen.
In other words, then, the manipulation of history creates real effects in the individual's personality. So it is not an absence of knowledge that's occurring when you and I talk your history. You are put into a state of consciousness and many of your abilities are wiped out and destroyed as a result thereof. That is why your history is not being taught to you correctly, so that your potential will be forever undeveloped as a people, and you will not challenge those people who rule over you.
Ignorance is not bliss. In fact, it is a major factor in all the evil in the world. So the question is, how much more evil can you stand to witness?
Every black person understands and realizes the first time you are reminded that you are black.
The British government recognises that Kenyans were subject to torture and other forms of ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration.
The fact that you don't really teach colonial history in your schools.
Reminding every day that your race means nothing.
It shows me as an old man there is hope for the future of this country.
The Age of Discovery or Exploration is a term given to a period of time between the 15th and 17th century where European countries were motivated to seek new routes for trade and commerce. Some of these motivations stemmed from the admiration or competition of other empires around the world, who were, quite frankly, a lot better at securing their bag than the poor Europeans. By the 15th century, the Venetians and Ottoman merchants were the main ones running trading within the Mediterranean. And so, this made other European countries think of new ways to create their own direct link with the Orient in a bid to cut out the pricey middleman. And with technological advancements in shipmaking and navigational instruments thanks to inspiration from the likes of Arabs and other cultures, this was now possible. So, in the 15th century, Europeans did just that, with Portugal being the first nation to dabble in some good old exploration. However, during their expeditions, European nations encountered new landmasses, and with them, the indigenous people. Of course, the most famous example is 1492, when Christopher Columbus landed on present-day Bahamas and met the indigenous tribes living there. These people are very unskilled in arms. With 50 men, they could all be subjected and made to do all that one wished. And so just like that, modern-day colonialism became a very trendy idea indeed.
His third voyage, 1503 or 1504. He's got to get back to Spain. He doesn't have enough resources, not enough food for his crew. So he asks the natives, would you please give us some of your stock that you have collected from your farming? Now, this particular group of natives only makes exactly the amount of food they need to tie to the next crop. They don't have surplus. So they said, no, we don't have surplus, sorry. Columbus knew that 1 week hence, coincidentally, there was going to be a total lunar eclipse where the moon in its orbit around Earth enters Earth's shadow. The full moon enters Earth's shadow and disappears. Columbus said, and he knew about this because he had read the tables, the eclipse tables, all right? He says to the natives, if you do not give us food, my God, which is more powerful than your God, will make the moon disappear and it will turn blood red. That will happen in 1 week. You have 1 week to comply. Sure enough, right on cue, the moon begins to disappear. That is a famous woodcut, and notice the natives bowing to him, and he stands proudly because he knows the science. He knows the astronomy. He knew this. And so he invokes this to dominate people who are not yet scientifically literate.
Other expeditions followed, such as in 1519 when Spanish Hernán Cortés made it to the highly sophisticated Aztec Empire in what is now known as present-day Mexico, or in 1532 when Francisco Pizarro came across the Inca Empire with their amazing wealth and highly efficient road networks. These European explorers were poor and were actually in awe from the advanced and rich societies they encountered in the Americas, and there was a lot to be in awe about over on the other side of the pond too. The first explorers had many reasons for their exploring. Establishing trade was one, but they were also very eager to uncover the vast riches they perceived to be in abundance in Africa. Now, this was partly due to the major flex of this man.
Mansa Musa.
As king, he personally owned over half of the old world's known gold reserves. On a single trip through Cairo, he once spent so much that he caused the price of gold to crash, pushing Egypt into an economic slump.
Mansa Musa, an emperor of the Mali Empire during the 14th century, who was widely regarded as the richest person to have ever lived. So yeah, I think we can see why Africa was looking very alluring to the Europeans. By the 17th century, Europeans were settling all along the coast of West Africa, where they married rich female African nobles to attain links and networks into the continent's markets. However, Africa of course had one resource that proved far too useful for the Europeans: labour.
The enormous amount of hand labor required to grow and pick the cotton was supplied by great numbers of slaves. This then was the economic background of the plantation. Cheap slave labor producing one main crop on vast tracts of land owned by the planter.
And so, the Atlantic slave trade was established, and the switch between European trading empires to colonial ones was really in full swing.
We were slaves, we belonged to people. They sell us like they sell horses and cows.
Was that in Charlotte that you were a slave? Was that in Charlotte or Charlottesville?
That in Charlottesville.
Charlottesville, Virginia.
Sell the women, sell the men. Oh, and then if they had any bad ones, they'd sell them to the nigger traders, what they call the nigger traders, and they'd ship them down south and sell them down south.
You see, the Europeans found that instead of just controlling trade posts within a region to exploit trade within the area, it was much more beneficial for them to establish political control of the actual region and its people. Between just the 16th and 18th century, around 12 million Africans were enslaved and working in plantations in the Americas. Things really started to kick off in the 19th century, when European nations started to industrialize. Suddenly, these countries had mass supply and were very eager to share their newfound wealth with the world. The infamous Berlin Conference between 1884 and 1885 involved 14 European countries discussing how they would split Africa between themselves to avoid conflict with each other. Notably, no African representatives were present.
Africans were not aware that there were conferences being organized in Berlin to determine about them. No, they did not know about it. They only saw the consequences.
By 1914, 90% of Africa was divided between 7 European countries, with only Ethiopia and Liberia remaining independent.
What it did was it carved up what are thought to have been about between 6,000 and 10,000 political units in Africa, and they were then carved up, often cutting peoples in half, water tables just sort of cut off from their sources. It was complete geographical madness. Simply drew lines on the map, places where they had not even been yet. They had no idea what was there.
And there was one country in particular that got a very generous slice of cake for themselves.
Go to schools now, they're teaching so many languages. Why? This is the UK. You know, you don't mind French, the standard basic curriculum. If they want to teach Indian, then they go to their own schools for that. But this is the UK, and this is not being racist at all. It's common sense at the end of the day.
A 2016 government poll found that 44% of the British public were proud of Britain's history of colonialism, while only 21% regretted that it happened, and 23% indifferent. The same poll also found that 43% of the British public thought that the British Empire was good, while only 19% said it was bad, and the remaining indifferent.
Historical amnesia?
So why do we see these figures? Well, it all boils down to a concept I like to call the post-colonial lens. Put simply, These are indoctrinated beliefs we have today as a result of traditional and modern colonial biases that have shaped the very lens in which we see the world. One of these lenses has especially been manifested in recent years.
Yeah. And they're out breeding us? Do we? And they're out breeding us as well, aren't they? You know what I mean?
There's a lot of Muslims here, you know.
In the town?
Yeah.
No, not really, compared to nowhere else. It's all knock-on effect, isn't it? Next door move out first because they don't want them next door, because they live like animals.
So, as a public service, I present to you, the good British folk, just a few out of the many things your great nation has achieved. Do a little search of concentration camps on Google and you'll find numerous links regarding the horrible Holocaust performed by the Nazis.
In fact, historians Ian R. Smith and Andreas Stuckey note in their article that in 1938, infamous Nazi leader Hermann Goering pointed out to the British ambassador to Berlin that it was during the Boer Wars in South Africa from 1900 to 1902 that the term concentration camp first became well known in English.
The British rounded up around a sixth of the Boer population who lived in the independent South African states and detained them in camps strikingly similar to the Auschwitz images we see in our history lessons.
Around 28,000 white Boers died in the camps, plus at least 14,000 black Africans, although it may be far more than that, we don't know because racism.
The AMRITSAR massacre in 1919 involved the shooting of unarmed peaceful civilians in Amritsar, Punjab by the British India Army under the orders of Brigadier Dyer. The soldiers used all of their ammunition when they killed anywhere from between 300 to 1,000 Indians and injured another 1,000 in the space of just 10 minutes. Brigadier Dyer was even celebrated as a hero afterwards by the British public, who raised over £25,000 as a, little thank you.
As Her Majesty the Queen said before visiting Jallianwala Bagh in 1997, it is a distressing example of our past history with India. We deeply regret what happened and the suffering caused.
And despite the fact that they've said, yes, it was bad, why do you think they've fallen short of a formal apology?
But in many ways, the notion of an apology is, possibly for everyone else, is a bit of a red herring because it gets the government or people who espouse the views of people like Dyer from the past and the whole notion of empire just being purely good. It gets them off the hook in many ways.
There's a word that most historians have carefully avoided when writing about the Irish famine. It's the word genocide. It's too explosive for most because they say the Irish famine was not the result of a deliberate policy of genocide by the British authorities in the 1840s. It's more complex than that.
In the 1840s, Ireland went through the Great Famine, dubbed the Potato Famine, during which Charles Trevelyan, the man responsible for providing relief during the famine, actually refused to hand out food to starving people and instead forced them into labour so that they would then have to buy the food from him. The Great Famine led to the death of 1 million people and the immigration of another 1 million into America. The Mau Mau uprising was a war between the Kenyans and the British colonial authorities which occurred between 1951 and 1960. During this time, the British rounded up thousands of Kenyans and detained them in camps where they were raped and tortured. The total number of deaths varies between historians, from 20,000 to up to 100,000.
They beat him until he'd drunk so much water that his stomach swelled and it started coming out of his mouth, nose and ears. Eventually he died.
Did you have cause to give the order to or yourself put your boot on their neck of these resistors, the ones that were howling?
Can we stop talking for a moment?
No, because I'd quite like you to answer that.
I will answer it when I have stopped talking for a moment. I'm sorry, but I...
Well, do you have a problem with that question?
No, it's a hypothetical question.
No, it's not. It's a very precise
You've
question.
asked me, did I put my foot on anybody's neck? No. I know where those questions are coming from.
Well, these are in the memorandum written by the Attorney General at the time to Bering.
I did not read it.
Okay, well, I have read it. And he describes you telling him that in some detail, that if they resisted, that they'd be knocked to the ground, and if they continued to resist and howl, a foot would be placed on their neck, and if they continued to resist after that...
You asked if I did it.
They'd be made to be unconscious. I asked you if you personally did it, yes.
You asked if I did it.
Yes, and you say
And
no.
I did not.
Did you cause the order to be given? Did you give the order to do that? Are you not going to answer the question?
No, I'm looking at you with certain thoughts in my mind.
India's share of the world economy when Britain arrived on its shores was 23%. By the time the British left, it was down to below 4%.
Britain's role in the Indian subcontinent dates back to the good old days of our European explorers, with the establishment of the British East India Company in hopes of making money off the spice trade. However, this private enterprise gradually took political control of the subcontinent, which was eventually handed over to the British government in 1857. Cue in the British Raj.
In fact, British policies on famines, which killed 35 million Indians in totally unnecessary man-made disasters because of British policy, were exactly the policies they pursued in Ireland that led to so many deaths in the Great Potato Blight and led Irish people to flee to America. Indians, of course, didn't have that option.
Winston Churchill diverted food to British soldiers and countries such as Greece while a deadly famine swept through Bengal, a man-made famine and millions of lives lost. But not to matter, according to Churchill himself, since he hates Indians for they are a beastly people that breed like rabbits.
We missed the bus for the Industrial Revolution, true, but we missed the bus because the British Empire threw us under its wheels. It's as simple as that. We were the world's leading textile producers, the world's leading textile exporters, the world's leading shipbuilding country, the world's leading steel manufacturers. All of these industries were destroyed by the British quite deliberately.
Philosopher Herbert Spencer and Carl Persson were big fans of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution during the 19th century, but what these men did was go even further and apply it more specifically to sociology. That is, the ideology that humans are on the same trajectory in life, so nations that weren't already industrialized like the Europeans must simply just be less developed, less evolved, and in dire need of a white saviour. In other words, it was the white man that all humans should aspire to be like, and it was the white man's burden to make this a reality.
Rudyard Kipling's 1899 poem, The White Man's Burden, in which he depicts the white man as being burdened by the responsibility of bringing colonised, non-white people to the light of civilization.
Edward Said's 1978 book Orientalism was a major player in establishing post-colonial discussion.
There was a kind of repertory of images that kept coming up, you know, the sensual woman who's there to be sort of used by the man. The East is a kind of mysterious place full of secrets and monsters. You know, the marvels of the East was a phrase that was used. And the more I looked, the more I saw that this was really quite consistent with itself. You know, it had very little to do with people who had actually been there.
Orientalism focuses on the creation of the concept of the other, the barbaric Africans, Caribbeans, Asians, Middle Easterns, as opposed to the logical and civilized Europeans and North Americans. It's this very concept that our lovely European explorers used to justify their cause. They weren't colonizing countries out of malice or greed, but out of the responsibility to bring civilization to these savages who are less evolved and live like animals.
To live like animals.
I think the presence of this other factor, which is very anti-Islamic, where Israel regards the whole Arab world as its enemy, is imported into American Orientalism. I mean, the idea, for example, that Hamas terrorists on the West Bank are just interested in killing Jewish children is what you derive from looking at this stuff. And very little attention is paid to the fact that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza has been going on for 30 years. It's the longest military occupation in this century. And so you get the impression that the only problem is that, you know, Israeli security is threatened by Hamas and suicide bombs and all the rest of it. And nothing is said about the hundreds of thousands, millions of Palestinians who are dispossessed and living miserable lives as the direct result of what Israel has done and is doing. So there's a sense in which the Arab struggle for national independence and, in the case of the Palestinians, for national self-determination is looked at with great hostility as upsetting the stabilities of the status quo. And that makes it virtually impossible. It's a tragedy, virtually impossible for an American to see on television, to read books, to see films about the Middle East that are not colored politically by this conflict.
It's this dehumanization of people that allowed Churchill to starve millions of Bengalis. It's this dehumanization that allowed Europeans and Americans to ship hundreds of Africans across the Atlantic. It's this dehumanization that allows the hundreds of black people to be murdered with no urgency for justice to be found by our governments. And it's all in the name of the white man's rights and superiority in this world.
Our war is a war against evil. This is clearly a case of good versus evil. And make no mistake about it, good will prevail. The United States is ready to lead that coalition, not only in Afghanistan, but wherever we find terror.
It was the white man that all humans should aspire to be like, and it was the white man's burden to make this a reality. Number 1. An awareness of representations of non-Europeans as exotic or immoral other. The first step in recognizing post-colonial lens in Peter Barry's beginning theory. Number 2, an interest in the role of language in supporting or subverting that power dynamic. In other words, how language is weaponized to fit a post-colonial lens. Almost all colonized countries were forced to use the colonized language, with the active suppression of their own mother tongue.
We must do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and colour, but English in taste, opinions, words and intellect. Further, to those opposed to such a process of acculturation, he suggested that I have never found one among them who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia.
Language is indeed the most powerful weapon of the colonizers. Its effectiveness is in the subtleties and the unconscious biases it plants inside the minds of the people.
Smug, greedy, well-fed white people have invented a language to conceal their sins. It's as simple as that.
France forced the francophone, and I hate that terminology. There is no such thing as francophone, anglophone. They made it up.
And it's language that is a major factor of number 3. An emphasis on identity as doubled, hybrid or unstable. Homi Bhabha is another big figure in post-colonial discussions and is a big advocate of the concept of mimicry in the post-colonial reality.
For Bhabha, mimicry is the effect of the doubling that takes place when one culture dominates another. Some of those dominated will attempt to mimic those in the dominant culture. Members of the dominant culture will encourage mimicry among those they dominate. This applies to the colonial situation, obviously, but also to post-colonial ones, where there's a strong push for minorities to assimilate to the majority culture. Hybridity takes the colonized away from his or her own culture and identity, shaping a people who are neither themselves nor their colonizers. So in other words, there are people who are sort of in between, without an identity, without a really usable, effective identity. Bhabha sees ways in which mimicry challenges dominant cultures. For example, if an Indian can learn English as well as an Englishman, act English, play cricket, drink tea, do all the other things that make up Englishness, the dominant culture can seem like it's a performance. It's not something you're born with so much, it's something you learn, something you do, something you perform, something you act out. In other words, the colonizer wants the colonized subject to mimic the dominant society, but wants that subject to get it a little bit wrong, wants that subject to be a little bit ridiculous in its performance or failed performance of Englishness or Frenchness or whatever it is that it's putting on.
It was not an intention that people should say, I'm a Nigerian, I'm a Ghanaian, I'm this. What are you? That's not what it was about. It was creating an African identity forged in a global perspective. This meant that for many people, we became devoid of culture. Our status was only determined by what was happening around us. This was a mistake, and ultimately has led to the situation that we now have. So the children of the so-called Caribbean, and the children of the continent of Africa, and the children of the African-American experience, and the children of the other American experience, in other words, the South American experience, and the children of the African-Asia experience, and the children of the African-Pacific which is a different kind of experience, and the children of the African Oceanic tradition and the children of the African European experience are for the most part devoid of their own African root. Even those Africans in Africa are devoid of their own African root.
The way you dress, the way you talk, everything about you screams, I have been infiltrated and colonized once again, just like my forefathers were. Your forefathers were colonized by men on ground with boots, whereas you guys are colonized, I'm sorry to say it like this, but with ideas.
Number 4. A stress on cross-cultural interactions. Geopolitics around the world is dominated by the remnants of point number 1. That's because it's been ingrained into us that the Western perspective is the universal experience of the world. This bleeds into everything in our societies today, from the fact that your favourite works are often whitewashed, to the fact that black people are murdered by those sworn to protect us.
You think about India, then you have that concept of tribal nationalism against, and where the Muslims are seen as the enemy within. You go to the United States, you have a majoritarian view which is largely white, Anglo-Saxon, and who are the enemies there? The enemies are the dissident intellectuals, the enemies are the Democrats, the enemies are the Mexicans, the enemies are the migrants. In Britain around Brexit, same sort of issue. We want to claim back our country. And who are the enemies? The enemies are those minorities who threaten the majority. So tribal nationalism is continually saying to the majority, you are being threatened. You've got to claim your country back. Make America great again, which is like saying make America hate again.
Colonization is very much alive today, in all of its different forms.
We were way ahead of them in our civilization. They set out to destroy us. And Berlin Conference put the nail on that coffin. So they gave Djibouti the same sovereignty as the United States. They gave Burundi the same sovereignty as China. They gave Togo. You see, the EU realizes individual little countries, they can't survive on the world stage. So they come together as the European Union. Now picture this now. So they cut up this Africa into the tiny little countries, small economies that could never survive on their own, but gave them the same sovereignty as the big boys. So that way, when the little bitty countries go to the world stage for the purposes of development and discussing trade, they're wannabe boxers who are being thrown into the heavyweight boxing ring every day.
The neo-colonialism of Africa, this time by a new superpower, China, the slavery still being performed in parts of the Middle East, the decades of illegal occupation by Israel in Palestine.
Many of these Middle Eastern interventions by Anglo-American and other powers and European powers was in the name of spreading democracy, of spreading civil society. So the old paradoxes of empire and the growth of the nation exist today in relation to interventions in countries based on the new notion of global progress.
And amongst all this, we're all still suffering from the ramifications of the centuries of white imperialism and colonization, the bloodshed caused by the decisions made from our white saviors. It's difficult to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it is our duty to illuminate the darkness ignorance has left us in, because until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.
Ask yourself what is really going on. Because what they are telling you is really going on is just a shiny object. The real issue is over here. And you need to stop before you start being used as an instrument of your own self-destruction.